In the summer of 1943, Luftwaffe commanders sat in Berlin briefing rooms listening to reports from their fighter pilots. The Americans had been bombing Germany for nearly a year, and the news from the front was almost uniformly positive. The B-17 Flying Fortress, that lumbering four-engine giant, was proving to be anything but a fortress in the European skies. German fighter pilots were racking up kill after kill. American bomber losses were staggering, sometimes exceeding 10% per mission. The mathematics were simple and brutal. At this rate, the Americans couldn't sustain their daylight bombing campaign. They would either switch to night bombing like the British, or they would bleed themselves white trying. But within a year, everything would change. The hunters would become the hunted. And the Luftwaffe commanders who had dismissed the B-17 and its crews would learn a terrifying lesson about American industrial might, tactical adaptation, and the game-changing arrival of long-range fighter escorts. This is the story of how the Luftwaffe went from predators to prey in the skies over Europe.
To understand the Luftwaffe's initial confidence, we need to go back to 1942 and early 1943. The United States Army Air Forces had committed to a controversial strategy: daylight precision bombing. While the British had switched to nighttime area bombing after suffering devastating losses in daylight raids, the Americans believed they could succeed where the RAF had failed. Their confidence rested on two pillars. First, the Norden bomb sight, a revolutionary device that promised unprecedented accuracy from high altitude. Second, the concept of the self-defending bomber formation. The B-17 Flying Fortress bristled with .50 caliber machine guns. In theory, a formation of B-17s flying in tight combat boxes could create such an interlocking field of defensive fire that enemy fighters would be shredded before they could press home their attacks. It was a beautiful theory. Reality proved far more complex. The first American heavy bomber raid against occupied Europe took place on August 17, 1942. 12 B-17s attacked the marshalling yards at Rouen-Sotteville in France. It was a modest beginning: shallow penetration, heavy fighter escort from the RAF Spitfires, and minimal opposition. But as the Americans pushed deeper into occupied territory and eventually into German airspace itself, the limitations of their strategy became brutally apparent. The Luftwaffe had been fighting for 3 years. Their pilots were experienced, their tactics refined, and their commanders understood how to exploit the weaknesses of bomber formations. The B-17 was indeed heavily armed, but it had blind spots. The most dangerous was the direct frontal approach. Before the introduction of the chin turret, the nose of a B-17 was defended by only 2 handheld .50 caliber guns operated by the bombardier and navigator, who had other responsibilities and limited fields of fire. German fighter pilots, particularly those flying the Focke-Wulf FW-190 and Messerschmitt Bf-109, developed head-on attack tactics. They would form up miles ahead of the bomber stream, then dive through the formation in a near-suicidal frontal pass. The closing speed was enormous, perhaps 500 miles per hour combined. Gunners had only seconds to engage. But a brief burst from the German fighter cannons and machine guns into a B-17's nose could kill the pilots, navigator, and bombardier, sending the massive bomber spiraling out of formation. The nadir of the unescorted bombing campaign came in August and October 1943, with the raids against Schweinfurt and Regensburg. These missions have gone down in history as some of the most costly air battles ever fought. On August 17, 1943, exactly 1 year after that first small raid on Rouen, the 8th Air Force launched a massive dual strike. One formation would hit the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg, then fly on to North Africa. Another would strike the ball bearing factories at Schweinfurt and return to England. The plan was bold. The execution was catastrophic. Of the 376 B-17s that set out that morning, 60 were shot down over enemy territory. Another dozens were turned with battle damage, many with dead and wounded crew members aboard. The losses approached 16%, unsustainable by any measure. But American commanders believed they had dealt a crippling blow to German production. They believed the losses, while grievous, were worth the strategic gain. They believed with minor tactical adjustments they could reduce casualties to acceptable levels. So, on October 14, 1943, they went back to Schweinfurt. October 14, 1943 is remembered in American Air Force history as Black Thursday. Of the 291 B-17s that departed England that morning, 60 were shot down over enemy territory. Another 17 were so badly damaged they would never fly again. Hundreds of American airmen were dead or prisoners of war. The losses exceeded 26%. Luftwaffe pilots had a field day. They had refined their tactics to a deadly science. They attacked in waves, hitting the bombers from multiple directions simultaneously to overwhelm the defensive fire. They focused on stragglers and damaged aircraft, picking them off like wolves culling a herd. They even experimented with bomber-destroyer aircraft, heavily armed and armored fighters designed specifically to break up bomber formations. In Berlin, Luftwaffe commanders analyzed the results with satisfaction. The Americans had been hurt badly. Surely they would have to abandon daylight bombing now. Surely this proved that unescorted heavy bombers couldn't survive against determined fighter opposition. They were right about one thing. Unescorted bombers couldn't survive. But what they failed to anticipate was American determination to solve the escort problem and the revolutionary aircraft that would change everything.
The American commanders weren't blind to their losses. They understood that their bombers needed fighter escort. The problem was simple but seemingly insurmountable: range. The fighters available in 1942 and early 1943, primarily P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, were formidable aircraft. The P-47 was a heavyweight bruiser, heavily armed and capable of absorbing tremendous punishment. The P-38, with its distinctive twin-boom design, was fast and deadly. But neither could escort the bombers all the way to targets deep in Germany and back. The P-47 could reach perhaps 400 miles from base with external fuel tanks. The P-38 could push a bit farther. But targets like Berlin, Munich, Schweinfurt, and the synthetic oil plants in eastern Germany were beyond their reach. For hours during each mission, the bombers flew alone through enemy airspace. The Luftwaffe knew this. Their commanders carefully tracked escort ranges and positioned their fighters accordingly. They would shadow the bomber formations, waiting for the moment when the American fighters turned back, fuel gauges reading empty. Then they would pounce. German pilots derisively called the area beyond Allied fighter range the free hunt zone. For them, it was open season on American bombers. But American engineers were working on a solution, and it came from the most unlikely of sources. The P-51 Mustang started life as an aircraft built to British specifications by North American Aviation. Early versions, powered by Allison engines, were disappointments at high altitude,
good for ground attack and low-level reconnaissance, but outmatched by German fighters above 15,000 feet. Then someone had a brilliant idea. What if they replaced the Allison engine with a British Rolls-Royce Merlin? The result was transformative. The P-51B, powered by the Packard-built Merlin engine, became one of the finest fighter aircraft of the war. It was fast, over 440 miles per hour at altitude. It was maneuverable, capable of turning with German fighters. It was well armed with 6.50 caliber machine guns, and most importantly, it was efficient. With external drop tacks, the P-51 could escort bombers to Berlin and beyond, an escort radius of 750 to 850 miles from base. For the first time, American heavy bombers could have fighter protection for their entire mission. The first P-51Bs arrived in England in late 1943. By early 1944, they were available in increasing numbers, and by February 1944, they were about to change everything. The test came during Big Week, a coordinated series of massive raids in late February 1944, targeting German aircraft production facilities. The 8th Air Force, now with substantial P-51 escort coverage, launched over 3,000 bomber sorties in 6 days, supported by hundreds of escort fighters. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them in force. This was exactly what the German defenders had to do. If they allowed these factories to be destroyed unchallenged, they would lose the ability to replace their combat losses. But now, for the first time, they encountered fully escorted bomber formations throughout the entire mission. The results were devastating for the Luftwaffe. On the first day of Big Week alone, 127 German fighters were shot down. Over the course of the 6-day campaign, the Germans lost hundreds of fighters, and crucially, many experienced pilots. In February 1944, 434 German fighter pilots were killed, 17% of their total strength, and many were the most experienced veterans. American bomber losses, while still significant, were far lower than the disasters of 1943. More importantly, the German fighter force had been dealt a blow from which it would never recover. The dynamic was shifting. The hunters were becoming the hunted. Imagine the perspective of a veteran German Luftwaffe pilot in early 1944. For 2 years, you had enjoyed a significant tactical advantage. You knew that enemy bombers would be unescorted for hours during each mission. You could choose when and where to attack. You could break off if conditions weren't favorable and return for another pass. You were the predator. Now suddenly there were American fighters everywhere, and they weren't just defensive, they were aggressive, extremely aggressive. The P-51 pilots had received new orders. Don't just protect the bombers, hunt the German fighters. Engage them before they reach the bomber formations. Chase them to their airfields. Strafe them on the ground if necessary. The goal was not just to defend, but to destroy the Luftwaffe as a fighting force. German pilots began reporting encounters with American fighters hundreds of miles inside Germany, distances that should have been impossible. Some refused to believe the reports at first. There must be forward airfields, they thought. Or perhaps these were captured German aircraft being used by the Allies. Reichsmarschall Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, understood the implications immediately. He reportedly said, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." It was an admission of defeat from the man who had promised Hitler that no enemy bomber would ever reach the Reich. The presence of long-range escorts forced a complete re-evaluation of the Luftwaffe tactics. The formations they had used so effectively against unescorted bombers became death traps when American fighters were present. German fighters trying to form up for coordinated attacks on bomber formations were themselves attacked before they could execute their plans. Pilots who had once carefully positioned themselves for optimal firing passes now found themselves fighting desperately just to survive. The Luftwaffe tried various solutions. They experimented with heavy fighters like the twin-engine Me-410, hoping its heavier armament could allow it to stand off from the bomber formations. American escorts tore them apart. They tried using single-engine fighters as escorts for their own bomber-destroyer aircraft. This just resulted in dogfights where the numerically superior Americans held every advantage. Some units resorted to attacking only when they had overwhelming local superiority, rushing in, taking one pass, and fleeing before American escorts could respond. Others tried to lure escorts away from the bomber formations with small diversionary forces. Occasionally, these tactics worked. More often, they simply resulted in more German casualties. The simple truth was that the Luftwaffe had lost the initiative. They were reacting rather than acting, defending rather than attacking. And in aerial combat, the side that is on the defensive is almost always at a fatal disadvantage.
By mid-1944, the statistics painted a grim picture for the Luftwaffe. German fighter losses averaged over 1,000 aircraft per month in early 1944. More critically, pilot casualties were unsustainable. Germany was losing experienced fighter pilots, the veterans who had learned their craft over Poland, France, Britain, and Russia, faster than they could train replacements. The mathematics that had once favored the Luftwaffe had reversed. Now it was the Germans who faced unsustainable attrition. American bombers still went down, certainly, but America's industrial capacity was producing B-17s and B-24s faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. More importantly, the American pilot training program was turning out crews by the thousands, and while new crews were green and vulnerable, enough survived to become experienced that the overall quality of American combat crews was rising steadily. Meanwhile, German pilot training was being cut shorter and shorter to replace losses. Fuel shortages meant student pilots received less flying time. New pilots arrived at combat squadrons with perhaps 150 hours total flight time, compared to 400 or more for their American counterparts, and were expected to survive against pilots who had flown dozens of combat missions. The kill ratios reflected this. In early 1943, Luftwaffe fighters might shoot down 3 or 4 American aircraft for every German fighter lost. By mid-1944, the ratio had reversed. American fighters were destroying 2 or 3 German aircraft for every loss. And what of the B-17 itself? The aircraft that many Luftwaffe pilots had dismissed was proving remarkably difficult to kill when properly escorted and flown in disciplined formations. Yes, B-17s were shot down by the hundreds, but many more survived damage that would have destroyed lesser aircraft. There are countless accounts of B-17s returning to base with enormous portions of their airframes shot away, engines destroyed, control surfaces shredded, yet still flying. One famous example is the B-17F All-American, which survived a collision with a German Bf-109 fighter that nearly cut the aircraft in half. The entire tail section remained attached by only minimal structure. Yet the pilot successfully flew the crippled bomber back to base, and all crew members survived. Other B-17s returned from missions with over 1,000 holes in their airframes, shattered noses, missing engines, and destroyed gun positions, but they made it home. These weren't miracles, they were testaments to robust engineering. Boeing had designed the B-17 with redundancy built into critical systems. The control cables ran through different sections of the fuselage, so that damage in one area wouldn't necessarily sever all controls. The fuel tanks were self-sealing. The structure could absorb tremendous punishment and remain airworthy.
When Luftwaffe pilots could make repeated, deliberate attacks on isolated bombers, they could exploit these aircraft's weaknesses. But when forced to make hurried passes through massed defensive fire while being pursued by escorts, they found the B-17 frustratingly durable. German ace Johannes Mackie Steinhoff, who flew around 900 combat missions during the war, later reflected on the dramatic change in the air war. The confidence of 1943 had given way to the grim reality of 1944. American air power was simply overwhelming German defenses through sheer numbers and superior logistics. Luftwaffe pilots described the terror of being pursued by P-51s deep inside Germany, far from any safe landing field. The Americans would follow them down, chase them home, and strafe their airfields. There was no respite, no safe zone, no opportunity to regroup and recover. On the American side, B-17 crews noted the dramatic difference escorts made to their survival chances. Early missions without escort had been exercises in terror, watching German fighters form up beyond gun range, knowing an attack was coming and being powerless to prevent it. With escorts present, those same German fighters scattered or were shot down before they could reach the bomber formations. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. American crews went from feeling like helpless targets to feeling they had a fighting chance. German pilots went from confident hunters to desperate survivors. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was caught in an unsolvable dilemma. If they rose to challenge the American bomber formations, they suffered catastrophic losses to the fighter escorts. If they didn't challenge the bombers, Germany's industrial capacity, including aircraft production facilities, was steadily destroyed. The Germans tried various desperate measures. They introduced jet fighters like the Me-262, which was fast enough to escape pursuing escorts, but these were too few, arrived too late, and were hampered by fuel shortages and Hitler's misguided insistence on using them as bombers rather than interceptors. They attempted to concentrate their remaining fighters for massive attacks on individual bomber formations, hoping that overwhelming numbers would allow them to push through the escorts. These operations occasionally inflicted heavy losses on a single bomber group, but the German fighter losses in these attacks were proportionally even worse. Some units tried to attack only the escorts, hoping to drive them away from the bombers. This accomplished little except depleting already inadequate fighter strength in battles against numerically superior opponents flying superior aircraft. By early 1945, Luftwaffe resistance had become sporadic. Fuel shortages meant that even when aircraft were available, they often couldn't fly. Experienced pilots were dead or grounded by wounds. The replacements arriving at squadrons were teenagers with minimal training sent up to die against veterans. American bomber formations now flew with relative impunity over Germany.
The story of the B-17 and the Luftwaffe is ultimately a story about how wars are won and lost. The Luftwaffe commanders who dismissed American bomber crews in 1943 weren't entirely wrong. Unescorted bombers were indeed vulnerable, and losses were unsustainable. But they underestimated three critical factors. First, American industrial capacity. The United States could absorb losses that would cripple any other nation and continue building more aircraft, training more crews, and sending them into battle. Second, American adaptability. When unescorted bombing proved unsustainable, American commanders didn't abandon daylight bombing or accept unacceptable losses as inevitable. They identified the problem, lack of long-range fighter escort, and solved it by developing and deploying the P-51 Mustang in overwhelming numbers. Third,
The resilience of American aircrew. The young men who climbed into B-17s knowing they faced terrible odds displayed extraordinary courage. They kept flying. They kept bombing. They improved their tactics, learned from their mistakes, and eventually, with proper support, they won. The ultimate irony is that the Luftwaffe's initial assessment wasn't completely inaccurate. The B-17 was vulnerable when unescorted, but by forcing the Americans to develop a solution to that vulnerability, the Luftwaffe inadvertently created the conditions for its own destruction. The P-51 Mustang didn't just protect bombers, it hunted German fighters aggressively, forcing them into combat on unfavorable terms. It achieved air superiority not just over bombing targets, but over Germany itself. And once that air superiority was established, the Luftwaffe never recovered it. By 1945, B-17s were still flying in mass formations over Germany, but any notion of them being flying coffins had been thoroughly disproven. They had proven remarkably resilient when given proper support. The transformation of the European air war between 1943 and 1945 remains one of the most dramatic reversals in military history. It's a reminder that in war, nothing is permanent. Tactical advantages can evaporate. Technology can shift the balance, and underestimating your enemy's capacity to adapt and innovate is often a fatal error. The Luftwaffe learned this lesson the hard way. From the cockpits of their fighters, watching American bombers pass overhead, escorted by swarms of Mustangs they couldn't evade and couldn't defeat. The Flying Fortress had proven its name, and the hunters had become the hunted.